Can a single row of grounded tankers destroy the world's fastest-growing tech hub? While global media praises Southeast Asia's unstoppable industrial boom, a secret energy chokehold is quietly pushing a manufacturing giant to the brink of a total blackout. The shocking truth isn't that the power is running out. It's who controls the switch, and how it's about to drastically change the price of the smartphone right inside your pocket. But wait, before we begin, please subscribe to ensure that you never miss out on any of my essential stuff. Comment, "I subscribe" below, and I will personally welcome you to our community. With that said, let's get started. For the past few years, Vietnam has been hailed as an economic miracle. When tech conglomerates desperately needed to escape geopolitical trade wars and rising labor costs, they flooded into this coastal powerhouse. High-tech megafactories broke ground at record speeds, fundamentally shifting global reliance away from traditional manufacturing hubs and turning cities like Bac Ninh and Haiphong into international buzzwords for industrial growth. But this entire glittering economic empire was built on a volatile, hidden vulnerability. Behind the sleek glass facades of state-of-the-art semiconductor cleanrooms and electronic assembly lines lies a brutal structural dependence on imported energy. The country has sprinted ahead industrially, but its power grid is lagging behind, desperately gasping for air every time global energy markets twitch. Meet Min. He's 64, a retired textile foreman living in a densely packed, labyrinthine alleyway in Hanoi. For decades, his modest pension was a safe, predictable shield that allowed him to live a quiet life. But as an unprecedented heat wave gripped the capital, sending temperatures soaring to a punishing 39 degrees Celsius, the reality of a global energy crisis crashed through his front door. The local power grid flailed under the load. Rolling blackouts swept his neighborhood, turning off fans and air conditioners in the dead of the night. Min sat in a stifling, uncooled living room, watching his refrigerator warm up and his vital blood pressure medication begin to spoil. Outside, the narrow street hummed with the aggressive, deafening roar of thousands of small, privately owned diesel generators. The air became thick, acrid with the smell of exhaust, and heavy with the silent panic of millions of families realizing their modern lives were tethered to a thread. The cost of fuel had surged so abruptly that Min was forced to make a devastating calculation: pay a 300% premium to black market fuel vendors just to keep his power running, or sit in absolute darkness and risk his health. This is an isolated stroke of bad luck, or a localized infrastructure glitch. It is a calculated, creeping macro crisis that threatens to unravel years of economic progress. According to an economic analysis by Vina Capital, severe geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East have pinned Brent crude prices consistently around the $100 per barrel mark. For an economy that fuels its manufacturing engine on imported energy, this price effect acts as an immediate, punishing tax on domestic growth. Vina Capital estimates the sustained oil shock threatens to slash Vietnam's full-year GDP growth by a brutal 1.5 percentage points, threatening the government's highly ambitious target of double-digit economic expansion. If you look closely at the streets of Ho Chi Minh City or Hanoi right now, you can see the exact moment the system began to fracture. State utilities have been pushed past their design limits. They have been forced to activate their absolute last line of defense, burning incredibly expensive, high-emission, oil-fired generation units at the Oman thermal power plant just to keep the national grid from experiencing a catastrophic systemic collapse. The world looked at this country and saw the flawless alternative to China's supply chains. But everyone forgot one catastrophic structural flaw, and it's about to trigger a hidden financial danger no one is talking about. To understand how deep this trap goes, we have to look at the three hidden cracks tearing through this hypergrowth economy right now, counting down from the most disruptive to the absolute most dangerous. First is the peak load illusion. You can build the most advanced semiconductor clean rooms on the planet, but they are utterly useless without constant, uninterrupted current. The national power system logged an all-time historic peak capacity of 53,512 megawatts in a single afternoon. National daily electricity consumption exploded past a record-breaking 1.116 billion kilowatt hours. Think about that scale. The country is consuming power faster than its domestic infrastructure can physically generate or transmit it. The grid is operating under a permanent state of duress. When millions of citizens turn on their cooling units simultaneously to survive the stifling 40 degrees Celsius heat waves, the entire industrial apparatus begins to starve for electrons. This creates a terrifying trade-off. Do you keep the lights on in hospitals and homes, or do you keep the assembly lines moving for the world's largest tech brands? Second is a supply chain freeze. Min's daughter, Lan, works the line at a massive electronics assembly plant in Bac Ninh. Her facility supplies components that directly feed the global tech market, manufacturing parts that wind up in devices sold across North America and Europe. Last week, her supervisor stepped onto the floor with a grim announcement. The factory was ordered by the state utility to immediately curtail its power usage during peak afternoon hours, part of a desperate demand response protocol to prevent a total regional blackout. Lan felt a cold sweat break out despite the heavy heat of the factory floor. Her shifts were cut cleanly in half. Her hands, calloused from years of precision assembly, shook as she calculated her next paycheck. She watched as the facility brought massive, loud diesel backup generators online just to keep the delicate machinery from freezing up entirely. The roar of the engines was a stark reminder that the factory was surviving on borrowed time and incredibly expensive fuel. If you're watching your own investments right now, wondering how to shield yourself from this fallout, the warning signs are clear. This supply chain friction means a massive bottleneck for consumer electronics is quietly building. When factories are forced to throttle production due to power allocation, shipping dates slip, overhead costs skyrocket, and margins collapse. Diversifying your portfolio into localized, off-grid infrastructure or defensive commodities is no longer optional. It is a necessity because the consumer tech sector is about to absorb a massive shock. Third, and this is the ultimate revelation, is the depleted shield. To shield the public from immediate hyperinflation and keep factories profitable, the government relied heavily on its domestic regulatory tools, specifically its price manipulation mechanisms. But a critical disclosure from the Ministry of Industry and Trade exposed a terrifying reality. Vietnam's Central Fuel Price Stabilization Fund has run down to just over 5.6 trillion VND, roughly $212.5 million. At the current rate of emergency market intervention, that fund can only protect the domestic economy from the raw volatility of global oil prices for about 15 days. The financial cushion that kept the miracle alive is completely worn through, leaving the country totally exposed to the brutal winds of global inflation. The safety net is gone, and that's exactly when things took a far more dangerous turn. As the financial shield dissolved, the government was forced to look across its borders for an emergency lifeline. In a historic shift, authorities have launched an aggressive campaign to rapidly scale up electricity imports from neighboring countries, turning heavily to Laos and China just to keep the industrial northern zones from going completely dark. Vietnam imported a record 2.92 billion kilowatt hours of electricity from Laos in the first quarter alone, a massive 120% surge compared to the previous year. But importing electricity through long-distance cross-border transmission lines is an incredibly fragile band-aid. These lines are highly vulnerable to physical disruptions, weather anomalies, and geopolitical leverage. If a political dispute flares up, or if neighboring countries experience their own domestic climate emergencies, the supply can vanish in a heartbeat. The dependency hasn't been solved. It has just been outsourced. How does a nation break a global energy stranglehold when its strategic reserves are actively hitting zero and its neighbors hold the power lines? The answer isn't coming from overseas oil fields or emergency foreign imports. It's being built from the ground up by the people who have the most to lose. Lan refused to let her family's security slide away. She recognized that the old model relying on a centralized fossil fuel grid was dying. She leveraged her technical background to secure a position with a rapidly expanding domestic solar cooperative. Industrial parks across the country, terrified of state-mandated rolling blackouts that cost millions of dollars in lost productivity, are bypassing the centralized grid entirely. Under the newly enacted direct power purchase agreements, large industrial consumers are finally allowed to buy clean energy directly from private renewable developers. They are covering millions of square meters of factory roofs with private solar arrays and localized battery storage systems, creating independent, self-sustaining microgrids that don't care if the state grid fails. For Min, The structural pivot brought direct, tangible relief. Land's co-op helped install a small-scale solar and battery storage setup for his neighborhood block. The system partially restored his home's power during the peak blackout hours, keeping his environment stable, his refrigerator running, and his vital medication safely chilled without relying on volatile, state-subsidized fossil fuels. The hard data proves this decentralized approach is the only viable path forward for emerging economies. The International Energy Agency's policy tracker highlights that developing nations shifting aggressively toward decentralized renewable grids experience 35% fewer industrial shutdowns during international energy embargoes and fuel supply shocks. The state is now moving with absolute urgency to codify this change. They are fundamentally rewriting their energy laws under the revised Power Development Plan 8, aiming to nearly triple the nation's total power capacity by 2030, with an aggressive focus on wind, solar, and massive battery storage systems. The government has even formed a brand new council to evaluate the immediate revival of the long-suspended nuclear power projects in Ninh Thuan province, recognizing that solar and wind require a massive, stable, zero-carbon baseline to support heavy industry. They are rushing to completely redesign their competitive electricity market to guarantee long-term survival, aiming to pump over $136 billion into infrastructure upgrades over the next 5 years. But this transition requires an immense amount of time and capital, and the global energy market isn't waiting around for the concrete to dry. An intense geopolitical race in the resource-rich waters of the South China Sea is closing in fast, and regional superpowers are watching Vietnam's energy vulnerability with intense interest, looking for any opportunity to expand their influence over the world's next manufacturing superpower. It leaves the country facing a definitive, historic choice that will shape its path for the next half-century. Would you risk a nation's economic sovereignty on cheap foreign oil just to keep consumer prices artificially low today? Or would you accept immediate financial pain to build a completely independent nuclear and green energy grid? Tell us what you would do in the comment below, and let's get the conversation started.